Jake Walker didn't expect anything different that night. His shift was the same as always, cold, lonely, and full of dull noise from Dock 7's air processors. He was a cargo mechanic, not a hero. He worked alone on the outer edge of the human space station, far from the busy zones where officers and tourists walked in clean boots and talked about stars like they owned them. Out here, near Dock 7, the air always smelled like burnt wires and recycled sweat. The walls were rusted. The floor panels creaked. No one came out this far unless they had to. That's why Jake liked it. No one bothered him. No one asked questions. But something changed that night. It started with a sound. A soft clatter, like a metal lid hitting the floor. Jake paused. His hands, oily from fixing a coolant valve, froze in midair. The sound came again. Not loud, not violent, just careful, nervous. He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and stepped out from the maintenance room. The hallway was empty, as expected, but the noise was coming from outside. He moved slowly toward the docking platform's back edge, where the waste containers were lined up like silent tombs. Cargo stations always had trash, broken parts, leftover rations, empty canisters, but no one ever came to dig through them. Except tonight. Jake stopped just before the last container. His boots made a soft thud against the metal. He crouched and peeked around the edge. That's when he saw her. Tall, thin, wrapped in a dark, torn cloak. Her skin was a faint purple, like bruised fruit, and her arms were long, too long for a human. She moved quickly, digging through a pile of discarded ration wrappers and broken panels. Her head jerked up, listening for danger. Then she reached into the trash and pulled something out. A half-eaten protein bar, stale but not rotted. She turned slightly, and Jake saw the small bundle strapped to her back. A child, smaller than a human toddler, with silver eyes that blinked slowly, weakly. The child didn't cry. It just watched. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. The woman froze. She felt him somehow. Her body tensed. Her head turned. Their eyes met. For a second, time stopped. Jake didn't feel fear. He felt something else. Shame, maybe, or sadness, because the look in her eyes wasn't angry. It wasn't wild. It was tired. So very tired. Then she vanished. With a flash of movement, the alien mother grabbed the child tighter and bolted down the dark side corridor, moving faster than he thought possible. In 2 heartbeats, she was gone. Jake stood there, blinking. What had he just seen? An alien refugee, a thief, a mother. He looked down at the trash. The protein bar wrapper still lay there, crumpled, dirty, half-bitten. He could still hear the soft rustle of her cloak in his mind. When he returned to his maintenance bay, he couldn't focus. His hands moved, but his mind stayed stuck on the mother and her child. Who were they? Why were they digging through garbage in a human zone? And why did no one else see them? At midnight, he sat on his bunk and opened his toolkit, thinking about the strange device he had picked up from the trash pile before she ran. It looked like a translator, an old one, cracked screen, frayed wires, but familiar. He turned it over and saw the symbol, a spiral, not human. Jake sat back. He hadn't seen that symbol in years, not since the war. Most people didn't talk about it anymore. The war had ended. Peace treaties were signed. But not everyone had survived. And not every refugee had found a home. The translator buzzed faintly when he powered it on. It flickered. Static. Then one weak, broken word played through the speaker. Help. Jake stared at it. His heart beat faster. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. Reporting her would be the easy path. He could alert security, file a report, go back to work. But something about her eyes stayed with him. They were not the eyes of a criminal. They were the eyes of a mother. The next night, he returned to Dock 7 with a small bag of food. Real food, not trash. He placed it gently near the trash containers and waited in the shadows. Hours passed. The air grew colder. She didn't come. But the bag was gone in the morning. So he came back the night after that, and the next night, and the next. Every time, he left food, water, a blanket once. He never saw her again. Not fully. Sometimes he'd hear a whisper, a shuffle, a shadow slipping past the edge of his sight. He never chased her. He only waited. Then one night, something changed. He heard a soft cough. Jake turned the corner near the containers and saw a small figure sitting alone in the dark. The child. No cloak, no mother. The child was shaking, arms wrapped around thin legs, breathing fast. Jake dropped to one knee. "Hey," he said gently. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The child looked up. Pale silver eyes met his. Jake reached slowly into his pack and pulled out a warm meal cube. He unwrapped it and placed it on the ground, sliding it forward. The child didn't move. Jake stood up and stepped back. After a long pause, the child crawled forward, picked up the cube, and began to eat. Small bites, careful, like food was still a trick. Then the child looked at him and whispered one word, "Mama." Jake's heart twisted. Where was she? Why was the child alone? Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed from above, the hum of a security drone. Jake looked up. Too close. He had to move. He scooped the child into his arms without thinking and ran toward the vent shaft he had seen once before, a narrow space in the wall, barely big enough for a person. But he remembered the scent of warmth, faint traces of body heat on his thermal scanner days ago. He crawled inside with the child and whispered gently, "It's okay. I'll find her. I promise." In the dark, the child held on to him. Jake didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away anymore. Not from her. Not from this. Something had begun, and it was far from over. Jake didn't sleep that night. He stayed awake, crouched in the narrow vent shaft with the small alien child curled up against him. The metal walls were cold. The air was dry. Every sound from outside made Jake tense. The low hum of the station's systems, the clicking of boots in the hall, the soft buzz of a drone passing too close. The child didn't speak again, just rested, breathing slow, small hands clutching the front of Jake's jumpsuit, like he was the only safe thing left in the world. Jake didn't know what to do. He had never held a child before, never wanted to. But now, holding this tiny life in his arms, he felt something heavy in his chest. A need to protect. A quiet panic. What if the mother never came back? What if she had been caught? Or worse? He waited until morning, then carefully crawled out of the shaft. The child stirred, weak but awake. Jake wrapped the little one in his jacket and carried him through the back maintenance corridors, where cameras were blind and humans rarely walked. Back in his private storage room, his hidden corner of the cargo bay where no one bothered to check, he placed the child gently on a folded blanket. The child blinked slowly, too tired to move much. Jake could see the signs of malnourishment now. Sunken cheeks, pale skin, thin limbs that trembled even at rest. Jake opened his pack and pulled out a meal cube, warmed it in a small heat coil, broke it into soft pieces. He didn't say much, just let the child eat in silence. The child never smiled, never cried, just ate like it was the last time food would come. Jake looked away. Later that day, while the child slept curled under the blanket, Jake left and returned to the trash area behind Dock 7. He stood there for hours, waiting, hoping. But she didn't come. Instead, he found something else. Near the wall, hidden behind an old broken crate, was a smear of blood. Dark purple. Not much, but fresh. Jake touched it with a gloved finger, still sticky. His stomach tightened. He scanned the area. No cloak, No footprints. Nothing. But the blood was real. Something had happened. He went back that night with a new plan. Using an old portable scanner, he mapped the heat signatures around Dock 7 and the surrounding shafts. He searched every vent, every pipe, every hidden space she could have used. Hours passed. Then, finally, movement. A faint heat source deep in a blocked tunnel near the station's water systems. Weak, flickering, fading. Jake didn't wait. He pried open the old grate and crawled in, pushing through dust and broken wires. The air smelled damp, like rust and mold. His scanner beeped softly, guiding him deeper until he reached a small open space. She was there, collapsed on her side, breathing shallow. Her cloak was torn, one arm twisted awkwardly. Blood soaked the floor beneath her. Jake moved fast. He knelt beside her and checked for a pulse. Weak, but there. Vila, he whispered. He didn't know her name. Not yet, but something inside him told him this was her, the mother. He pulled out the translator he had repaired, switched it on. Static. Then a flicker. He held it close to her face and spoke slowly. I have your child. He's safe. I'm here to help. The translator buzzed. Then her lips moved. The words came through in a broken mechanical voice. Where is he? Jake nodded. Sleeping. Safe. I swear. She blinked slowly, trying to sit up. Her body shook with the effort. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. Don't move. You're hurt. The translator clicked again. Don't take him. Please. Not like them. Jake shook his head. No, I'm not like them. I just want to help. Her eyes, golden and filled with pain, locked on his. She didn't believe him. Not yet, but she didn't run either. She couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to trust someone. Jake looked around. There was no way she would survive in this place. Not without help. He leaned down, speaking gently. My name is Jake. You need help. Let me take you. The translator crackled, then repeated his words in her language. She didn't answer, but she nodded. It was enough. Jake carried her back through the tunnels, slow and careful, always watching for cameras. He returned to his hidden storage room and laid her beside the child, who opened his eyes and made a soft sound. The mother smiled, weak and broken, but real. She reached out, touched her son's face, and whispered something Jake couldn't understand. He looked away. Later, he cleaned her wounds and wrapped her arm with what supplies he had. It wasn't enough, but it would help. She fell asleep quickly, exhausted. Jake sat nearby, back against the wall, watching them. Everything had changed. He couldn't go back to just being a mechanic. Not now. Not after seeing them like this. Not after knowing. He didn't know who they were or what had brought them here, but he knew this. They didn't deserve this life. No mother and child should have to hide in the shadows, digging through trash just to survive. And he knew something else. Someone was looking for them. That blood trail hadn't been from a fall. It had been from a fight. Jake reached into his pack and pulled out the translator again. He stared at the spiral symbol. This wasn't just about helping strangers anymore. It was about a secret, one that someone wanted to stay buried. But Jake had already started digging. And he wasn't going to stop now. The name came quietly, like a whisper carried on weak breath and worn-out hope. Vela. Jake heard it from the translator as he gave her more water, carefully holding a chipped plastic cup near her lips. She could barely drink, but when he asked again, softly, kindly, she finally answered. That's your name, he said. The translator hummed, then replied, Yes, Vela. Jake nodded. He liked it. It suited her. Gentle, strange, strong. The small alien child stirred under the blanket nearby. He reached toward his mother's hand and held on. The boy's eyes, silver and too quiet for someone his age, didn't leave Jake for long. He watched everything, every movement, every word, not afraid, just unsure. Jake didn't blame him. He didn't know what they'd been through, but it had left scars. Not all of them were on the skin. For 3 days, Jake stayed with them, bringing food in pieces, patching up wounds, keeping the vents covered. He barely slept. He didn't go to his usual shift, knowing it might raise questions, but he didn't care. He couldn't believe them now. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what he knew. Vela spoke more now, using the translator in short, quiet sentences. She moved carefully, her arm still wrapped in a sling Jake made from old cloth. Each word she gave him was a piece of the puzzle, and Jake listened like her voice was a map he needed to memorize. She had been a healer once. Not a soldier. Not a spy. She had studied medicine on her home planet, a place called Ilarion, a world full of forests that shimmered like glass and rivers that sang in different tones depending on the wind. Jake had never heard of it. No one talked about Ilarion, because Ilarion didn't exist anymore. Vela's people, called the Ellerin, had joined the Human Alliance during the early peace talks, decades ago. They offered technology, healing methods, new knowledge. In return, they asked for protection. But something went wrong. The alliance broke. Jake had seen the war on the news when he was younger. Quick reports, short words, terrorists, civil unrest, non-compliant species. But Vela's story was different. She didn't talk about war. She talked about betrayal. A human science fleet had arrived on Ilarion years ago, asking for volunteers. Medical research, they said. Sharing knowledge, they said. Vela had worked with them directly. She remembered the human doctors, the machines, the questions. Then the volunteers began disappearing, and the science ships left in silence. Weeks later, human warships returned. Jake sat in silence as she told him. They called us unstable, Vela said through the translator. Dangerous. But we were only asking why. Why they took our people. Why they lied. Her voice trembled. We had no weapons. We had only our minds. Our knowledge. They'd burned it all. Jake didn't know what to say. Vela's eyes looked past him, far away now. She had escaped with her son, barely alive, aboard a smuggler's ship that had pitied her. The ship dropped her on a neutral supply station, then left. No papers, no safety, just a warning. Don't be seen. They're still looking. Jake stood up and paced the room slowly. His thoughts were loud inside his skull. This wasn't just about helping a mother and child anymore. This was about truth, about what had been hidden, buried. He remembered the translator he had picked up, the one with the spiral symbol. It had once belonged to her. She had dropped it the first night they met, when she ran from him in fear. The spiral was not just a symbol. It was a warning. It's a mark from Project Harmony, Vela said when Jake showed it to her again. Her voice cracked. Her fingers trembled. Jake froze. He'd heard the name before, in whispers. In classified files he once helped move as a cargo tech. Nobody ever explained what it was. They just moved it under full lock, with 3 levels of security. What is it? Jake asked. Vela looked at her child, then back at Jake. It was the name of the research project, the one that took our people. They said they were finding ways to mix DNA, to heal sickness. But they were looking for something else. She pointed gently to her son. Jake followed her hand. The boy had a strange, faint glow along his right palm, barely visible, but not natural. A smooth circle under the skin. A mark. Jake leaned closer. His breath caught. What is that? Vela hesitated. They called it the seed, a hidden strand, part of something older, something they didn't understand, but they believed we carried it, and they wanted to take it. Jake looked at the boy's face. He didn't look like a weapon. He looked like a child. Jake ran a hand through his hair and sat down, hard. His heart pounded. If what she said was true, if the humans had destroyed an entire race just to chase this seed, then what else had they done? What else had been covered up? And why was this child still alive? Someone is hunting us, Vela said. Not for who we are, but for what he carries. Jake looked at her. His voice was quiet. What do you want me to do? Vela looked at her son again. I want him to live. Jake nodded. It was enough. That night, he snuck out and moved through the dark back routes of the station. He hacked into the data hub using an old passkey from a broken scanner. Inside, he searched station logs, looking for any signs of alerts, flagged movements, sensor pings. He found something. A record of unusual life signatures near Dock 7, 3 days old. Then he saw the alert that followed, coded Red Shadow, internal language, not public, sent directly to someone outside the station. Jake traced the line. A bounty, placed on a non-identified alien female. No name, no species, no charges. Just the word, retrieve alive. Child optional. Jake's blood turned cold. He copied the file and wiped his trail. Someone already knew Vela was here, and they were coming. He returned to the storage room with fast steps and a plan growing in his head. He sat with Vela and gave her the news. We don't have much time. She didn't panic. She just nodded. Jake looked at the child, still asleep, still unaware. We're leaving the station, he said. Vela blinked slowly. Where will we go? Jake didn't know yet, but he knew one thing. He'd rather die protecting them than stand by it while the truth stayed hidden. Something deep inside him had changed. He had spent most of his life fixing broken machines. Now he was going to fix something far more important. He didn't know how. He just knew he had to try. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that child away. Not while he still had breath. Not while he still had a chance. The lights on the station flickered more than usual the night Jake decided to run. He stood by the old service lift in the lower cargo bay, his heart pounding hard against his ribs. Beside him, Vela leaned against the wall, her cloak pulled tight over her body. She looked stronger now, barely, but her eyes still carried the shadows of pain and fear. The child was bundled in a makeshift wrap tied to her front, sleeping lightly, his tiny fingers curling now and then. Jake's bag was packed. Food cubes, water, a portable heat blanket, a broken scanner he had patched together, a fake ID chip, and the small data disk he had copied from the station logs, the one with the bounty alert and the word Red Shadow on it. He kept the disk hidden in the lining of his boot. If things went wrong, that disk might be the only truth left behind. The lift doors opened with a soft hiss. They stepped in. The lift descended slowly, moving through layers of steel and silence until it stopped at the bottom deck. The smuggler's zone. Officially, this part of the station was marked as inactive, but everyone knew that wasn't true. The lower level was a maze of forgotten storage rooms, half-dead lights, and things that weren't supposed to exist. If you wanted something illegal, you came here. If you wanted to disappear, this was where you started. Jake led the way through narrow corridors. Every step echoed. He glanced back often to check on Vela. She didn't speak. She just followed, quiet and calm, her movements sharp with awareness. They reached a heavy door covered in old markings. Jake knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The door creaked open. A man stood inside, broad-shouldered, metal arm, scar down his left cheek. His eyes narrowed when he saw Jake. Well, the man said. Didn't think I'd see your face again. Jake gave a tired smile. Hello, Rix. Rix didn't smile back. You still owe me 2,000 credits and a plasma cutter. Jake shrugged. I've got something better now. Rix's eyes moved to Vela, then to the child. You bring trouble to my door, Walker? Jake nodded. The kind you can't ignore. They stepped inside. The room was filled with crates and parts. Old engines, wires, fuel cells. On one side sat a small ship, rusted, patched, ugly as sin, but it had wings and fuel. That's all Jake needed. "I need the Sparrow," Jake said. Rix laughed. "That junker. She hasn't flown in 6 years. She'll fly," Jake said. "You kept her clean. I knowed you." Rix crossed his arms. "You planning to steal from pirates or start a war?" Jake pointed to Vela. "She's being hunted. By someone who doesn't care who they hurt. They'll come through this station soon. You want them sniffing around your business." Rix's smirk faded. "I see." He walked over to the ship, kicked one of its landing legs. "She needs new coils, one engine slow, and the Navcorps still thinks Pluto is the center of the galaxy. But she'll fly." Jake reached into his coat and handed over a small chip. "This is a copy of a data file. Project Harmony. Human Command lied about it. If I don't make it, you send that to every news node on the Outer Rim. All of them." Rix raised an eyebrow. "Now you're really starting a war." Jake didn't blink. "So be it." They worked through the night. Jake rewired the cockpit, while Rix got the fuel cells loaded. Vela stayed close, watching everything with sharp, silent focus. She asked no questions, but her hands moved fast when she helped patch the ship's air filter. She knew machines. Jake didn't even have to explain. He liked that about her. By dawn, the Sparrow hummed softly, old but ready. The engine lights were dull orange. The door ramp was open. Jake helped Vela up the ramp and guided her to the small sleeping bay. The child was still asleep. They were almost free. Then the alarm went off. A high-pitched screech echoed through the docking zone. Lights turned red. The station's warning system kicked in. Unauthorized scan detected. Inbound ship. Class C. Hunter class. Jake's blood went cold. "They're here," Vela whispered. Outside the docking zone, the air shimmered. A ship uncloaked mid-air, sleek, black, lined with red lights. A predator. Bounty Hunter Tech. Rix looked at Jake. "You'd better run." Jake ran. He jumped into the cockpit and fired up the Sparrow. The engines roared. The hull shook. Lights blinked. He flipped switches fast. "Vela, strap in," he shouted. She did. The doors started to close behind them, but too slow. The bounty hunter ship opened fire. A blast hit the far wall, sending crates flying. Jake yanked the control stick. The Sparrow lifted off the ground, shuddering, sparks raining from the back vents. He slammed the launch button. The ship shot forward through the outer airlock tunnel. Metal groaned. The exit gate blinked red. Dock override. Locked. Jake cursed. He hacked. That night, as the child slept under a patched-up blanket, Jake explored deeper into the old mining base. He moved carefully, flashlight in hand, avoiding weak floors and hanging wires. Then he found something strange. A door marked Research Holding. Restricted access. It was still sealed. Jake's heart skipped. Why would a mining station have a research wing? He opened the panel beside the door, tapped into the system with a manual port. The data logs were old, corrupted, but some files remained. He downloaded them to his reader. The first one made his stomach turn. It was marked Project Harmony, Secondary Lab. His fingers froze. The name again. He opened the file. Inside were reports, cold, clinical, about biological testing, sample types, DNA strains, notes about behavior under stress. There were mentions of subject class, aileron, and then notes. Seed detected. Sample 44 shows adaptive healing properties. Testing continues. Jake backed away. This station wasn't just abandoned. It had been part of the program, a hidden piece of a dark puzzle. He returned to the small room where Vela sat awake, holding her child and humming a soft, wordless tune. He sat down and showed her the file. She read it in silence. Her face didn't change, but her hands clenched tight. "They were here too," she whispered. Jake nodded. "I think this moon is a graveyard, not just for miners." Vila looked around the room, then down at her son. They wanted the seed, but they didn't understand it. Jake leaned forward. "Then what is it, Vila? What's really in him?" She hesitated. "He is not a weapon. He is a bridge." Jake frowned. "Between what?" Vela looked at him, and for a moment her golden eyes seemed to glow in the pale light. "Between what was broken and what can be healed." Jake didn't fully understand, but he believed her. Outside, the cold wind howled through the broken metal of the mining towers, and far above them, somewhere in the stars, the hunter's ship moved again. Looking, searching, closing in. The abandoned moon never made a sound, but something about it always felt loud. Jake woke early. The light from the stars filtered through a cracked dome above the ruined control room. He sat up slowly, pulling the blanket from his shoulders, and looked across the room. Vila was already awake, sitting beside her child, eyes watching the shadows. She hadn't slept much since they arrived. Neither had Jake. Every creak in the broken metal, every wind that howled past the vents, sounded like footsteps. They both knew someone was coming. Jake stood, stretched the ache out of his back, and walked to the console he'd salvaged the day before. The old mining base still had some working systems. He'd managed to bring a few of them online. Cameras, life support, a low-power generator. But more importantly, he'd cracked into the research lab's deeper logs. That morning, he opened a file labeled Level 3, Genetic Anomalies. His eyes moved across lines of data, slowly, like reading a ghost's diary. Subject 44, partial Ellerin child. Tested at 6 months. Shows rapid cellular regeneration. Energy spikes during stress. Unstable readings. Termination advised, delayed for further study. Subject 45, pure Ellerin. No seed activity. Transferred off-site. Subject 46, hybrid embryo. Unsuccessful merging. Notes. Human DNA incompatible. Jake stopped reading. He felt sick. This wasn't research. It was something darker, something twisted. He stood and left the console, walking to the back chamber where Vela sat in silence. Her child, finally, was sleeping peacefully. Jake crouched beside her. "There was more," he said. She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded. "I think they tried to create more of him," Jake said, his voice low. "Not just study, but copy." Vela's face remained calm, but her hands tightened. "They always wanted to shape life," she said softly. "They called it evolution. We called it theft." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He looked at the child, still so small, still so quiet. "What does the seed really do?" he asked. Vila hesitated. Then she spoke. "It connects." Jake tilted his head. "To what?" "To everything." Jake blinked. Vela's eyes stayed steady on his. "It's not just in our bodies. It's older than us. A design in the stars. In the ground. In memory. My people carried it quietly, like a spark in our blood. The seed is not a weapon. It is a thread." Jake listened, not fully understanding, but hearing the weight in her words. "They feared it," she said, "because they couldn't control it." Jake stood up again, mind racing. Everything he'd learned in the last few days, everything he'd believed before, it was crumbling. He wasn't a cargo worker anymore. He wasn't just a man trying to help a stranger. He was in the middle of something bigger. And then the signal came. A red light blinked on the console. A warning ping. Jake rushed to it and checked the feed. Movement. A ship had entered the moon's orbit. No ID signal. No open communication. Just one long, steady scan, pulse after pulse, sweeping the surface like a blind man's hand searching for a heartbeat. Jake stared at the screen. They found us. He turned to Vela. She didn't flinch. She simply stood, picked up her child, and waited. Jake moved quickly. He shut down all non-essential systems, killed the lights, powered down the generator. They would hide. They had to. Hours passed. The ship above made no landing, no sound. But then, through the vents, they heard a soft thud. Then another. Boots. Heavy ones. Jake grabbed the old shock rifle he'd found in the ruins. Barely working, its charge low, but better than nothing. Vela crouched in the corner, cradling her child close. Jake moved to the doorway. He saw them. 2 figures. Dark armor. Red visors. Moving slow, careful. Not soldiers. Not officials. Hunters. Jake's pulse raced. He waited until they passed the first hallway, then slipped out the side and followed them through the shadows. He stayed low, quiet, watching their patterns. They weren't searching randomly. They had a map. They knew where the research room was. Jake realized something. These men weren't just hunting Vela. They were here to recover the old data, to erase it, to make sure no one else ever saw what this place had once done. He followed one of them into the lab, heart thudding in his ears. As the hunter began uploading a virus into the old data core, Jake moved fast. He raised the shock rifle and fired. The bolt hit the man's back. Sparks exploded. The hunter dropped. Jake lunged forward and grabbed the ID stick from the fallen soldier's gear, pulling the power cell too. Then he ran. The second hunter turned at the sound, shouted something in a rough voice, and fired his weapon. Jake dove behind a broken console. The blast ripped through the wall above him. He crawled backward, then used the stolen power cell to reboot a nearby door lock. It worked. The door slammed shut between him and the hunter. Jake bolted back toward the chamber. Vela was already on her feet when he returned. "We need to leave now," he said. "There's nowhere to go," she answered. Jake didn't argue. He shoved a crate aside, opened the hidden shaft he'd found earlier, a narrow tunnel that led to the outside ridge, shielded from scanners. "We're not going far, just out of sight." They moved through the shaft, crawling, breathing hard, every sound behind them louder than the last. Finally, they'd reached the edge. The surface was cold, the wind sharp, but they were outside now, hidden in the rocks, the ruined towers above them casting long shadows. From this view, Jake saw the hunter's ship below, landed now, its ramp open. Then, from inside the base, an explosion shook the ground. Fire. They were burning the lab, destroying the truth. Jake's face tightened. He looked at Vela. Her eyes were steady. Jake whispered, "I won't let them finish what they started." She nodded once. The child stirred in her arms. And then, in the distance, another ship appeared in the sky. Small, not military. It flickered its lights in a pattern Jake recognized, a smuggler's signal. His message had gone through. Rix had sent help. Jake stood tall. Hope returned, just a flicker. But a flicker was enough. The war for truth had begun, and he wasn't alone anymore. The rising glow of the second ship's engines turned the broken cliffs of the moon into flickering gold. It descended slowly, careful not to kick up too much dust or draw fire from the hunters still inside the ruins. Jake stood still, half hidden in the rocks with Vela and her child behind him. The air was thin and biting cold, but none of them moved. He recognized the shape of the ship immediately. Rix had come. But whether that meant hope or trouble, Jake didn't yet know. The ramp of the ship opened with a long hiss, and a figure stepped out, tall, wrapped in a thick coat, face covered with a rebreather. But Jake would have known that cocky stance anywhere. Rix. He raised a hand in greeting, but his other hand was already near his holster. He was cautious, always. Jake raised his own hand in return. Then he called out, "We're here, but we're not alone." Hunters are inside the base. Rick stepped forward, motioned to someone inside. Two more figures emerged from the ship, one carrying a heavy energy cannon, the other a medical pack. Smugglers, no doubt, but friends of Rick's were rarely the clean kind. Still, Jake felt a strange wave of relief. For the first time in days, he wasn't the only one protecting them. Vela stepped beside him, her child bundled in cloth and silent as the stars. She looked at Rick's, unsure, measuring him. Rick's eyes moved to her, then to the child. "This the one?" he asked. Jake nodded. "The last. Maybe the only one left with the seed." Rick's frowned. "You sure you want to do this, Jake? You go with me. There's no going back. No quiet job. No safe life." Jake turned slightly, looked at the boy in Vela's arms. "I stopped having a safe life the day I saw her digging through trash." Rick's gave a slow, impressed nod. "You've changed." Jake shrugged. "No, I think I just woke up." Suddenly, a blast rang out from the base below. A fireball burst from the side of the facility. One of the hunters had triggered something, maybe a final burn, or maybe they'd found Jake's sabotaged system. Either way, it was a signal. They knew the fugitives were still alive. And nearby, Rick's gestured to his people. "Get inside. Cover the ramp." Jake grabbed Vela's hand, guiding her across the rocky surface. Her steps were careful, holding her child tight. They moved as fast as they could, but the hunter ship had already begun to rise again, black wings unfolding like a predator stretching after sleep. A searchlight beamed from under its belly. Jake cursed and shoved Vela forward, shouting, "Go! Get on the ship." The light swept across the rocks and stopped. Right on them. The hunter ship began to pivot. Jake turned, raised the shock rifle he still carried. He knew it wouldn't do much against a ship, but it might buy time. He fired once. Sparks flew off the undercarriage. No damage, but the distraction worked. Rick's men fired back with the cannon. One blast struck the hunter's sensor array. The beam of light blinked out. Jake helped Vela onto the ramp. The ship rocked as Rick's shouted over the comms, "Get that ramp closed. We're lifting off in 10. The child was crying now. Not loudly. Not afraid. Just tired. Weak. Jake ran into the ship just as a missile exploded behind them, tossing him off his feet. The ramp slammed shut. The ship lifted. Outside, the hunter vessel gave chase. Red streaks of fire blazed through the sky as it followed. Rick shouted over his shoulder, "Strap in. We're jumping blind." Jake slid into a seat beside Vela and grabbed a harness. The ship groaned as Rick pulled them into orbit. The controls screamed. Lights blinked red. But the ship held. Jake turned to Vela. She was pale. Her child lay quiet in her lap, wrapped in blankets. She looked down at Jake with wide, unreadable eyes. Then the jump engine fired. Everything stretched. The stars became lines. And then, silence. They were gone. Hours later, the ship drifted in quiet space. No signals. No pursuers. Just a field of stars and a deep, endless calm. Rick stood at the console, shaking his head. "I'll never fly into a rock pile like that again." Jake smiled. "You say that every time." Rick gave him a tired grin, then looked at Vela. "So what now? You still got that data disk?" Jake reached into his boot and pulled it out. The small silver disk still blinked softly. Proof. He held it for a long moment. Then looked at Rick's. "You still know people. News nodes. Underground truth feeds." Rick's nodded slowly. "Some." Jake handed it over. "Send it." Rick's took the disk. "You sure?" Jake nodded. "The galaxy deserves to know what was done. And they need to know what still exists. He's not a weapon. He's not an experiment. He's a child. And a bridge." Vela's eyes glistened. Jake looked at her. "We'll find a place. Somewhere no one knows. Somewhere safe." Vela looked down at her child. "He will grow," she said quietly, "and one day when the stars are ready, he will bring light back to what was broken." Jake didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how far they'd have to run, or how long they'd need to hide. But he knew one thing. He had found a mother digging through trash to feed her child. But what he had really uncovered was truth. And once truth wakes up, it doesn't sleep again.